So I was in an event last night, and it was for the Dallas Hearing Foundation, and they're celebrating 20 years of the foundation, and so it was like a gala, or party, whatever you want to call it. I don't know the right way to say that. And it was a fundraising event for this doctor specifically, and what he does cochlear implants, and so basically their tagline is breaking the sound barrier for over 20 years, and it's just a neat deal. We heard just story after story of people and kids and people who have been deaf, and they got the cochlear implant, were able to hear and found this healing through these cochlear implants, and so just some really cool and neat stories. One of the things, though, that happened last night was Dale Hansen was there. He was like the MC of this event, and so Dale was talking. And Dale said one of the things that he remembers, it's an Asian proverb, and he said the proverb says, "I complained about my shoes until I saw a man with no feet." And Dale said, "I'm a complainer." Dale said, I'm a complainer. You know, if you see me around, he said, I harass people and I complain and I speak up on things. He said, but I have to remind myself of that proverb. He said, because I can easily complain about a hangnail or an upset stomach or, maybe whatever it might be. He said, but until I recognize the person who is in a much difficult and more challenging, more broken place. And so he said, he just kind of kept coming back to that proverb of, I complained about not having shoes until I saw a man with no feet. I heard another story, and we'll call him Justin, about a guy named Justin. He lived in Israel. He lived right along the Sea of Galilee, and he was a Christian, and he loved God, and he loved Jesus, and he wanted to give his life to Christ, but he wasn't feeling very close to God lately, and so he gave God really this ultimatum. He prayed to God. He said, God, Moses, he had this whole burning bush thing, and so, let's think about that. Or maybe Joshua in the Battle of Jericho, Joshua, he prayed, and the walls came tumbling down. You can go read about this stuff in the Bible. These walls came tumbling down. Or the disciples were with you on the Sea of Galilee, and the storm was coming up, and you told them, oh, you have little faith, and you calmed the Sea of Galilee. So this guy, Justin, said, I'm just going to sit outside. I'm going to wait for the burning bush, and if you'll give me the burning bush, or if you allow the walls to fall down, or if you allow the sea to be calmed in front of me, man, then I'm all for you. I'm all about living life for you, and I'm going to, I'm all in. Just give me some sort of sign that you are around and you are here and that you're in my life and that you're guiding me forward. And so he sat just day after day, just hanging out, leaning up against the wall, got the bush over there off to the side, Sea of Galilee in front of him, so Justin's just hanging out. Well, during that time, friends would come by and visit with him, and they're like, Justin, what are you doing? He's like, I'm just waiting for God to show up. And he's like, well, okay, if you're here. And they would tell Justin some stories, and there was one guy, he was saying, man, I'm really discovering new things about my faith. I'm really on fire for Christ and what Christ is calling me to do. I'm really excited about that. And so he's like, oh, cool, great, blessings. And we'll go on, and another guy would come up, and he's like, hey, Justin, what are you doing? Justin told him his story. I'm waiting for God to show up. I've been praying for him to show up. And as he's having a conversation with this other guy, the guy's like, God's been doing some cool things in my life. He's really just been breaking down some walls and helping me overcome some barriers and some sin and some frustrations and troubles in my life. And Justin's like, cool, that's really nice. I'm waiting for God, And then, again, so you know where this is all going. Another third dude came by, and, Justin, what are you doing? He told a story, and this third guy was like, oh, well, that's cool. I hope God shows up for you. He said, but man, God has been calming just my life and giving me a sense of peace and patience and whatnot. And so this went on for about like a week or 10 days. And so Justin's just waiting. And finally he's like, God, what is the deal? I've been here for like 10 days waiting for you to like burn a bush or knock down a building or calm the storms. Or do you no longer have power in my life? Do you no longer have power in this world? Why aren't you here? And God, Justin, for the first time, heard God's audible voice. God said, hey, Justin, what are you talking about power? I just shared 3 stories with you of the ways I'm bringing and burning in the lives of others. And I've been breaking down walls and calming people. He said, it's not necessarily my lack of power, but it's your lack of seeing clearly. And Justin's like, okay. I don't, this whole story's fake, to be quite honest. There's no Justin out there. But I wonder if too many times we're like the ones who complain about shoes and we miss seeing the people who have no feet. I wonder if we're the ones who want God to show up in these really mighty and powerful ways, and we're like, God, if you would just show up, I would give my whole life for you and just give me a sign of something, and I'm all for you. And there's all these signs of God at work in the world, and we miss out on those things. So we're talking about, for us, how do we really have the eyes to see where God is at work, but not only where God is at work, but how can God be at work around the tables that we find ourselves? I mean, you're going to find yourselves on all kinds of different tables. You're going to find yourselves, again, at pool tables and card tables and boardroom tables and kitchen tables and classroom tables, cafeteria tables. There's all sorts of tables that we'll find ourselves around. But what are we doing with our time around those tables? I went back and looked at a couple of videos. Well, one came up on my phone, and I should have downloaded it for you just because you could see what I have to live with. It was one of those things like, here's your memory from 5 years ago. Well, it was a memory of my son. He's now 8. He was 3 at the time. He's in his underwear. We're all eating dinner there at the table. And for whatever reason, he decides to get up and do a dance party on top of the table. And so, of course, we video it, and you're thinking, oh, he's cute, he's 3. But he's there in his underwear like, he's doing all this like, and his sisters are dying laughing. So, of course, if they're laughing, he's hamming it up even more. And I thought, you know what, that's what happens around my tables. People dancing in their underwear. And so that's not really a very productive thing when it comes to a God factor. But a lot of times that's what happens. A lot of times we go to our tables and, man, we have just some fun time. You're dancing, you're laughing, or you're talking, you're enjoying the company of others. But there's not necessarily a God factor there. There may be in that you're building some relationships and some sense of community, but not necessarily in a way where we can actually really multiply the kingdom, where people can get to know God and Christ in a way that forever changes their lives. But what if that were the case? And so today, just a quick history lesson. It won't be too terribly quick because I want to give you a little bit of history so you know what's going on. We're going to celebrate communion. And when we come into communion, it's an opportunity for us to be invited to the table, to be reminded of what Christ did on the cross. But before we get to it, the reason of the significance of communion is really because God's history with the Israelites way before Jesus ever came on the scene. And so if you remember, if you go back and read in Genesis, like chapter 12, the first few verses there, God came and talked to Abraham and Sarah, and said, listen, they wanted to have a kid. They're like, God, if you really love us, you'll give us a kid. And so they were in their late 80s, and they'd given up. I mean, they'd been praying this prayer for like 20 years, and they've been waiting for this to happen. And so God came and actually said, you're going to have a child. And they laughed. Sarah laughed, and she's like, you're crazy. I'm like in my 60s, 70s and whatnot. I'm not having a kid, man. You've already missed that opportunity. That doesn't really say that. I'm paraphrasing. You can go read. It's like 4 little verses of God basically said, no, you're going to have a kid. And not only are you going to have a child, but you're going to start, that child will have more children, and those children will be so many children that you will not be able to count them. There will be more than the stars and more than the grains of sand, and they still didn't believe it. They couldn't believe that God could do those kind of things. Well, then they got pregnant. So Abraham and Sarah had this covenant with God that they would be God's people. And Abraham and Sarah had a son, Isaac. Well, then Isaac had a son, Jacob and Esau. You'll remember maybe their story as well in the Old Testament. Well, then Jacob also had sons. He had 12 sons, if you can imagine that. And so his 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. So they were really kind of the leadership of Israel. Well, one of those 12 sons, the 11th son, was Joseph. Although he was the 11th son of Jacob, he was the favored son. And so the dad, Jacob, gave his son Joseph this coat of many colors to basically say, you're the best son that I have. Of course, we don't do that if your parents, you love every one of your children equally and they're all the same, and that's hogwash. Some are a little easier than others and whatnot. So obviously Joseph was the chosen one. Well, when he got the coat of many colors, what did his brothers do? They got mad. They're like, man, you're the 11th son. There's 10 people in front of you that are more important than you, at least in the birth order of things. And so how can you think you're so cool? And so they plotted against him. This is his half-brothers. There were 4 wives of Jacob. And so his half-brothers, his 10 half-brothers, plotted against him. They're like, you know what we're going to do with you? We're going to sell you into slavery. Yeah, real nice sibling. You think your sibling's not nice because they maybe ate your Twinkies out of the pantry or something? Man, think if they plotted against you to sell you into slavery. And so they plotted to sell Joseph into slavery. And so they sold him into slavery. So now he was in the land of Canaan where his family, a lot of the Israelites lived, and he had a lot of tribes and families in Canaan. Well, now he's in Egypt, and so he's in a different area. He's actually in Goshen, this area in Egypt. And so he's in slavery, and then he's in slavery, and then he's imprisoned. Well, as he's in prison, he is hanging out there, and he has the ability to interpret dreams. So people have dreams. He's like, oh, yeah, I know what that means. It means that you need to, go gluten-free. Or whatever. I don't know how he interpreted dreams, but he would tell people, some people would have these dreams, and he interpreted them. Well, there was a chef for the Pharaoh Now, Pharaoh in those days, there were tons of pharaohs. It's kind of like a king or a president. I mean, you might have tons of these different pharaohs over hundreds of years, and they're all called Pharaoh. Well, the Pharaoh, I don't even remember his name, the Pharaoh that was in power, the king that was in power when Joseph was there in Egypt, was having these bad dreams, these terrible dreams. He couldn't figure them out. Well, he also had a chef that he didn't like the chef, and so he put the chef in prison. Well, the chef knew that the king was having these bad dreams. Well, he's in prison now with Joseph, and the chef and Joseph get to be buddies. And the chef realizes that Joseph can interpret dreams. So the chef thinks, well, if I tell the king about Joseph, then maybe I'll get out of prison. We don't know the rest of his story. Who knows what happened to that guy? But Joseph got connected to Pharaoh, and he started interpreting his dreams. And they were so specific that Joseph could interpret the Pharaoh's dreams. So they were so clear to the Pharaoh that it actually started to help out the entire kingdom. He predicted famines that were going to happen and other things, and so they stored up grain and they prepared for these things over 6, 7, 8 years. And then as these famines came, they had all the grain and they had all the storage and they had all this stuff. So the king was like, Joseph, you clearly are someone of significance. He became Joseph, who had been sold into slavery, was in prison, is now the number 2 dude in Egypt. So if you're thinking you're having a bad day and you find yourself in your prison, who knows? A decade, you might be like vice president. Probably not, but maybe. Who knows? But Joseph has now gone from prison to the vice president of Egypt. This famine comes. His whole family is starving over in Canaan. And so he sends for him. And he has his brothers come. And they show up. They're like, what, Joseph, man, we love you. You're our favorite, sibling. And he's like, whatever. Well, fortunately, he loves God. Joseph loves God. And he's like, listen, go get our family, go get the whole group of Israelites and come to Goshen. And come to hang out in this area of Goshen. Because we're in a good place. And I'm a leader. And so the Israelites moved to this area of Goshen. And they thrived there. And there were so many good things happening to them. And it was partially Joseph. Well, a few hundred years went by. And a couple other pharaohs came along. And there was this pharaoh who was just total jerk. Just total jerk. I don't think the word jerk's in the Bible. But he was rude. I mean, he was just... So what he did is he saw the Israelites as free labor. And he's like, man, I'm the Pharaoh. I'm the king. I'm the greatest one ever. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make all the Israelites, all the people who are not Egyptians, now work for me. And so they had to build all these monuments, and they were doing all these things for this Pharaoh. And so now the Israelites, who had actually come to that land hundreds of years ago to be saved from famine, are now finding themselves in slavery. Well, then another story that happens here, this guy named Moses. You see, Pharaoh was afraid of some of the Israelites. They were getting too many, the Israelites. And so Pharaoh was like, well, there's too many Israelites, and there's not enough Egyptians, so I'll just solve this by killing all the firstborn sons. And so all the Israelites, all the firstborn sons, for actually everyone 2 and younger, for a number of years, they were being killed by Pharaoh in order to reduce the Israelite population. Well, there was a lady that was there, an Israelite. She had a baby, named him Moses. She didn't want him to die, so in order for him not to die, she put him in a little basket. She floated him down a river. Well, he goes down the river, and who's down the river just a few hundred yards? But Pharaoh's daughters and wives, and they're all like, I don't know, swimming, taking a shower, washing their pits. Who knows what they're doing? They're just doing daily stuff. They're hanging out in the river. As they're hanging out, all of a sudden, a little baby comes up in a raft. So what are you going to do? You're just going to watch it go by? No, man, they take the baby and they're like, what? I don't even know if they say what in the Bible, but this is how I picture the Bible happen. So they're like, a baby. And they're like, yeah, baby. They're like, a baby. They're like, let's take it home. And so they take Moses home. And so now Moses is being raised by Pharaoh and Pharaoh's daughters and wives and whatnot. And so all these women are caring for Moses. And so Moses grows up in all this wonderful luxury. He's an Israelite. He doesn't even know it. But then he figures it out. One of the other Israelites that know him and know the story and that he was put down the river and whatnot say, Moses, man, you're an Israelite. And Moses is like, I can't be an Israelite. I'm like, in the house of Pharaoh, man. I've got all this luxury and I've been educated and all this stuff. They're like, no, you're an Israelite. And do you see all these Israelites who are in slavery? Those are your people. And so Moses rises up, and he's like, all right, man, this isn't going to be. I'm going to take care of this. And so he takes his sword and he kills an Egyptian soldier. Well, that's not a very good plan. He just kind of went with passion and like, this shouldn't be. You can't like kill soldiers one at a time and overcome all of the Egyptian, military. So he killed a soldier and he's like, oh, not a good plan after it already happened. You ever been there before? You ever done something in life and you're like, that was not good. And but it's already too late. And so you're like, what do I do now? I'm going to hide or cover it up or do whatever I need to do. My kids are notorious for this, especially if something breaks. If something's broken, whenever something breaks, what they'll do is they'll try to like prop it up or fix it, enough so that it holds. So the next person that comes over, like the lamp's totally broken, and I go over and like to turn it on, and it goes into like 1,000 pieces, and they're like, well, Danny, what'd you do? And I'm like, what? It's ashes, it's dust. Like, you broke the lamp? How can you do that? And there's like drops of glue around, all this evidence that they were the ones that did it. But sometimes when we're like that, whenever we break things, or maybe when we feel broken, we try to run away from that, and we try to get away from that and hide those things. So Moses did that. He ran off in the desert, man. He's hiding out in the desert. He doesn't want anybody to know who he is. He's so afraid that Pharaoh's going to come and kill him. And that's when God shows up in Moses' life. He says, I need you. He says, the Israelites are in slavery, and they're broken, and they're hurting, and they're held captive. And he said, I hear the cry of my people, and I need you, Moses. This is the burning bush story. He lit a bush on fire. It didn't really consume. And this bush is burning. God's talking to him. And Moses is like, no way, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. I'm not a great leader. I'm not great in speech, and I don't speak very well and whatnot. I'm not doing it. And God's like, I'll send your cousin to help you out. You little sissy, just go do it. And Moses is like, fine, God, I'll go do it. He's really reluctant to do it. Have you ever been there? You maybe don't want to answer that one. You're just like, God, I'm not doing it. Even if God's calling you to something, you got this little sense in your mind like you need to speak up, or you need to share, or you need to do whatnot, and you're not necessarily willing to do that. And so Moses is totally doing that. He just wants to run from God. And God said, man, I'll give you some help. You don't need the help because you got me. I'm God of everything, of the entire universe. Just trust me. And Moses is finally like, all right, if you'll send somebody with me, I'll trust you enough. So then Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. There's a little song, Pharaoh, Pharaoh. Oh, yeah. Okay. So you can see that later. On the way home, you'll go into lunch, you'll be like, Pharaoh, Pharaoh. If you don't know that song, ask somebody who does. It's a fun little thing. And so, let my people go. So Moses is up there. He's singing his song in front of Pharaoh. He's saying, let my people go. And Pharaoh's like, no way. No way. I know who you are, and I let you in my house, and now you kill one of my Egyptian guards, and you've been out in the desert. I'm not letting your people go. I don't care who your God is. I'm Pharaoh. And Moses is saying, listen, there's a burning bush. I didn't want to be here. He called me out. I'm in front of you. I'm totally afraid, but I know he's big. He's going to hurt you. And Pharaoh's like, nah. Again, I'm paraphrasing a lot of the Bible. So Pharaoh's like, no way. So Moses is like, okay, I'll talk to God about it. God's like, all right, well, send a bunch of frogs and send a bunch of locusts and, kill all the animal, and all these things. And so 9 different times these plagues happen to basically get Pharaoh's attention. To say to Pharaoh, my God, Moses is basically interpreting as a representation of God there, saying, listen, my God is big enough to be in control of everything you hold precious. Your crops, your livestock, and all your riches and all of that. So 9 different times there's these 9 plagues that come to basically tell Pharaoh that God is bigger than Pharaoh. You need to let the Israelites go. And he didn't do it. Well, the one thing that was most important to Pharaoh is his lineage. It's his children. And so God said, the only thing I can do is maybe to get his attention is to take the very thing that he loves the most, his son. And so God, through Moses, told Moses, said, listen, here's what I want you to do. I want you to tell the Israelites, to all of them, to go get a lamb and take this lamb into their house and to live with this lamb for about a week. And after a week, they're going to sacrifice that lamb as an offering to God. And then as they sacrifice that lamb as an offering to God, they're going to take the blood of the lamb and they're going to put it over their doorpost. And so as God comes through the story, as the story goes, as God comes through and the angel of death comes through, all the firstborn Egyptians end up dying. So Pharaoh's son ends up dying. None of the Israelite children die. So Pharaoh is now so afraid, he calls in Moses and says, listen, take your people. I realize that your God is bigger than all of life. So take your people and leave here. And so the Israelites were set free out of captivity. They were freed from slavery. They were free from the things that bound them. As they set off and they went into freedom. That moment was so significant in the life of the Israelites and the Jewish people, they still celebrate it today. They still celebrate what God did to set them free thousands of years ago, that they have the celebration called Passover. It's where God passed over their houses as the blood of the Lamb was on the doorpost. And because God passed over their houses and allowed them to be free and their children to be safe, and they were set free, they give thanks to God every year. If you know any Jewish people, they celebrate Passover every year. It's the biggest festival in the Jewish tradition. They celebrate God at work. Okay, now fast forward a couple thousand years. Jesus comes on the scene. God hears the people crying out again, not just Israelites, but all people crying out for God. And God said, all right, I'm going to send you my son. And my son's going to love you and care for you and heal you and bring you beyond your sin and your brokenness. And so Jesus shows up on the scene, and so as he grows, he gets a little older. In his last 3 years, he goes into ministry, and in his ministry, what he does is healing people. He's helping people. He's bringing people out of their sin, out of their suffering, out of their brokenness, out of their pain, out of their selfishness and their pride, into a place of holiness and righteousness. And on the last night, before he was going to be crucified on the cross, he had a meal with his disciples. That meal was the Passover meal. So Jesus grew up as a Jew, that he had grown up his whole life celebrating this Passover meal. And so he is with his disciples celebrating this Passover meal. And this is what he says to them. It's in Luke 22. Verse 14, he says, when that time came, Jesus took his place at the table. And so he's having this meal. He took his place at the table, and the apostles joined him. And he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. I don't know for sure why Luke put this in there, why he recorded. If Christ is saying these things, why is Christ earnestly looking forward to sharing the Passover meal with his disciples? This is the final meal he's going to have with his 12 best buddies. 11 at this point. Judas, who was there, who was going to betray Jesus. Betray Jesus, has already left. So he's got his 11 best friends, and he says, I really want to have this final meal with you. And this is what he says. I have earnestly desired to eat Passover with you before I suffer. I tell you, I won't eat it until it is fulfilled in God's kingdom. After taking a cup and giving thanks, he said, take this and share it among yourselves. I tell you that from now on, I won't drink from the fruit of the vine until God's kingdom has come. After taking the bread and giving thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And in the same way, he took the cup after the meal, and he said, this is the cup of the new covenant by my blood, which is poured out for you. And so what Jesus is doing, Jesus is having the first communion. He's having Passover, but what he's doing is he's celebrating the first communion with the disciples. Now think about who's around the table now. So as you get to all of this history up to this point, and the fact that the Jewish Passover meal was so significant, because what it would do, actually, if you've ever been to a Passover meal, it's kind of a cool deal. They have all these different things that happen in the meal, and as things happen, they will always ask this question, why is this night so important? Or why is this night more important than all the others? And the answer is that because God freed them from brokenness and slavery. That's why Passover is so significant, because God can free us from brokenness and slavery. So Jesus is celebrating this Passover meal with his disciples. And think about the people around the table. You got Matthew. I don't know if you know Matthew. He was a tax collector. Tax collectors were cheaters. Man, they were selfish guys. They just wanted to get rich. And so that not only would they collect your taxes, they would basically collect their salary and then some. You know, if they wanted to go on vacation, they'd just come around to your house and be like, knock, 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 more taxes. And you're like, I don't have any money. He's like, oh, go to prison. Or they'll be like, well, I don't want to go to prison, so here's $100. And then the tax collector's like, sweet, I'm going to go out on the Sea of Galilee on a little sailboat trip. And so they were thieves. And so you have a thief sitting at the table with Jesus. You have Simon the Zealot. Simon, he was on fire for a lot of things, but he was also angry at times and was so prideful in the things that he did that he only was singularly focused So you got a guy who is this prideful, often angry person across the table with Jesus. You have Judas, he's already left. He's going to betray Jesus, so he's broken and hurting himself. You have these people that are broken around this table, and Jesus says, I earnestly want to share this meal with you. Why? Because this meal can bring about healing in your brokenness and can help free you from where you were enslaved. Now, I don't know if you shared a meal lately with anybody, but my guess is if you went into that meal, you didn't think to yourself and come into that meal of, how can I be an agent of God's grace and goodness to bring about healing in the life of the other person I'm with? Or even something even more simple. How is this person across the table from me broken, and how can I offer grace and mercy to them? Man, we don't like that. We don't like the dirty sort of ugliness of life, of sin and brokenness and sadness. Now, if someone's hurting sometimes, if they've lost a loved one or someone is sick or there's been some sort of challenge, we'll be good about, pulling up the meal train app and dropping off a meal and being like, I'm sorry, and I don't know what to say, and you drop off some food. And so you might do that little gesture. But we really have a hard time as a society and as a community actually sitting across the table from people and asking some really hard questions. Like, where are you hurting? Where are you broken? Where do you feel so far away from God that you don't even necessarily want to take the next step in your faith? We have a hard time with that because we don't know what to say. We don't necessarily know what to do. But the really cool thing is if you look at all of history and all these places, God was the one at work. Through Abraham and Sarah and Joseph and Moses and Jacob. And even in Jesus, Jesus is giving thanks to God for the meal. And Christ calls on God. And so when we sit across the table with people who are broken and hurting, it's not even us. If we invite Christ to be in us, and if we're living for Christ, then we can just sit there in the very presence and say, God, allow my words to be your words. Give me the wisdom to know what to say and how to say it. Or let me just sit silent with those who are hurting and broken. There are too many relationships that are broken right now. And if you might take the time to sit across the table from each other and just talk about some of those things in those broken places. There are too many people that you know at work and maybe in your neighborhood are hurting or at loss. And if we just sit across the table from them and just be the very presence of Christ in their lives. Say, how can I pray for you? How can I help you in this moment? Or just let them share what's going on. Do you use your table to help bring about healing and to help set people free from the things that enslave their life? There's an entire history of thousands of years in the way God is using individuals to bring about His glory in the world by helping people who are broken and hurting and enslaved by something in this world. And so I ask you, will you, in the future, make a conscious effort to use your table time to bring about healing in the lives of others? Because God has called you. If you believe in Christ and you live your life for Christ, then you've been called to be Christ in this world and to be a representation of Christ in the world. You don't need to wait for a burning bush or a falling wall or calming of the sea. If you're waiting for some sort of call on your life to go out and help people, this is it. You here today. You may be just sitting in today, if you never needed to, you're like, God, just let me know what to do. I'll tell you what God wants you to do. God wants you to be His hands and feet in the world. He wants you to be a representation of unconditional love. That's why.